Colleagues, I'm going to go right into it. The presentation, an overview for the first section, just understanding status quo. Just want to have a look. That's what it looks like, at least maybe if we can get that screen back. So that was just a quick glance. I'm aware of this big green background here, but at least it looks nicer if you see it online. So the green screen doesn't look that bad. Thank you to Brand Republic for that. So back to the topic. It's around status quo of the agriculture and agro-processing sector, the opportunities, and I specifically want to highlight 4 of them, and then the implementation. And I think that's a key point that we need to talk about this afternoon, is around the implementation of all of these plans and opportunities. So taking stock of the status quo. This is a graph that we're borrowing from the World Bank. Jeffrey talked about the post-COVID era, and there are already a lot of simulations around that. What is the potential impact of it? In essence, what this graph, the simulations from the World Bank are presenting is the blue bars are giving us a trend line of poverty or absolute poverty. That's the number of people living under $2 a day. Extreme poverty, and there was actually progress made. The global numbers are showing that we actually made progress in this space. And if you look at the red bars, those are estimates by the World Bank, where it's essentially we are back to levels that we saw in 2016, according to their simulations. And on the right-hand side, the blue section gives number of additional people again back into poverty, and the red, at least the blue is for Asia, South Asia, and the red section is for Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. We've inserted a block there. What's the South African trend in terms of poverty? We've made great strides forward in terms of the number of individuals experiencing hunger. And that reduced from 2002 about 29% to 11%. Now, we'll unpack more of that in terms of food security and where the real pressure points are, because we are seeing a rapid rise in unemployment. So these numbers need some more unpacking. The question is then, where does agriculture fit in? And the slide on the left-hand side, if we just look at our the GDP growth rates, and this is a real success story. So just looking at agriculture last year, 2020, the only sector that really expanded by 13.1%. And Tracy will take us through all the detail. But in essence, combination of bumper crops, higher prices, and really record export levels that really drove this wonderful growth that we saw in primary agriculture, while all other sectors had a decline due to COVID, and major decline, total economic contraction by 6.4% in real terms. Furthermore, if we think about the impact of agriculture and agro-processing, the total food value chain, food inflation is a very important indicator. And just comparing South African food inflation rates to the rest of, or not the rest, a number of developing countries and developed nations, we can see a relatively low food inflation rate, about 6.1% in the current season, or 2021, and about 4.6% last year. So these are, in relative terms, very low inflation rates. So, and that's a good news. So we have competitive value chains delivering food into big markets at very low or relatively low inflation rates. That's, however, not the full story of agriculture and its contribution to the economy. The formal economy we are not measuring. And this is just some research that we recently did, or at least a year or 2 ago, for the Pork Producers Organization. We've shown this graph a number of times, but let's just remind ourselves on those numbers. These are staggering numbers. The informal herd of pigs, 890,000 pigs, and we've provided you with a concentration map on the right-hand side. Look where those pigs are. There are 208,000 households in this space. And we did a survey of these little farms. These are 10 pigs, 20 pigs. And if you survey those farms and do the economics around it, it's an equivalent of about 23,000 jobs that are created by this informal sector. These jobs are not measured, they're not reported. The economic growth or the turnover is really not measured. On the left-hand side, we've got the commercial farms. The concentration of commercial farms is around our centers, our urban centers. That's where they're driving the very competitive value chains, feeding into those centers. The next graph we've adopted from IFPRI, our colleagues, Institute for Food Research and International Food Research Policy. And this graph is also, again, providing a very important context around the structure of our economy. AFS stands for African Agriculture Food System. And what this graph is showing us is the contribution of the agriculture food system to the total economy. So just look at a structure of our economy and agriculture's contribution. And now we're looking at the broader contribution. In other words, taking processing, trading into consideration. And we are very much in line with first world countries and countries like Brazil, China, France, USA. On the left-hand side, you see much higher contributions by primary agriculture. So Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana. So finding solutions and actually the opportunity that exists with a structure like this is immense. And this is, I think, some of the opportunities that we want to talk about. Often we hear a comment saying there's a big problem, agriculture's share of the economy is declining. That is not a bad thing. The reality is that the countries, basically the developing countries, are pulling resources off the farm down the value chain with higher skills, higher jobs, higher employment, better skills. And that's basically what we need. So there's essentially an increase in agriculture output, and in relative terms, we are decreasing as a share of the total economy. And that implies that we actually have an opportunity for creating jobs downstream and higher value jobs. And those are those value chains that are required to pull agriculture into a higher space, into a more competitive space. Just again, the pie chart confirming agro-processing agriculture around 2% and 9%. But as I said, these are official numbers. These don't measure the informal economy that we just illustrated to you an example on. Colleagues, then manufacturing and agro-processing, a combination of firms mainly in the commercialized large space. And here we can see actually the performance of these firms. I wonder if, can we ask that they keep it just on the view for slides, if possible? That we just have the slides for now. I think that's going to help. Thanks very much. Where we can focus actually on the performance of these firms and the size. And then the size of the bubble gives the size of this firm in terms of contribution to the economy. And then on the bar, we have how many jobs are created for every million rand of output. So here we can give an example. For example, in the grains, mill and starch industry, it's a large industry. It creates about 0.4 jobs per million rand of output. And if you look at the left-hand side, your y-axis, it gives us the performance of that industry. And here you can see the growth between 2014 and 2017. That's the numbers where we can get it from Stats SA, where we can have consolidated numbers. So look at those numbers in nominal terms. If you take out inflation, those growth rates are in real terms relatively low. So the sector is actually extremely competitive in sense of delivering food into these value chains in real terms around about 4 to 5% growth. And just I think the nature of the competitive nature of these industries is clearly seen in the performance, but also in terms of their contribution to the total economy. And where does a bulk of our number of low-income households lies? The concentration lies in rural economies. The biggest numbers lie in the urban centers, and we have to remember that. So again, illustrating this diverse nature of our value chains and where are the biggest pressure points. We need large-scale commercial value chains to deliver food into the urban centers. And then we need the informal value chains to get the productivity up, to supply the food security into the rural areas. So just in terms of the numbers, the projections, this is not changing. we are actually increasing the number of the share of our population into urban centers. So it was at 62%, currently estimated at 67%. It's going higher, 72%. So that's a lot of spaces that we need to fill in terms of food security and the biggest demand for our food. This graph here, some of you have already seen it. I hope it's becoming a famous graph by now in terms of the chickens, the broilers, Isak, your industry. But again, if you really dig into the numbers, it's mind-boggling. And this just gives you a very practical example of how diverse these value chains are. At the highest level, our small-scale, top bar, small-scale live chickens, a chicken selling around about 50 Rand a bird, and some of these prices are higher. Where's the concentration of that activity? You can see it in the map. And where's the concentration of the commercial birds? And those birds are produced at 23 Rand per bird. So you can clearly see this diverse nature of these value chains. The cost structures are different, the routes to markets are different, the product is different. The bottom part there, the commercialized value chains are directly competing with imports. Okay, so that's where that's the head-on. Commercialized value chains and the concentration of those industries. In the rural areas, completely different setup. That brings us to the farming system. So let's just understand our numbers in terms of farmers. And these are the statistics from the latest census by Statistics South Africa. There we can see 40,000 commercial farmers. These are VAT-registered farmers. We have a whole group of farmers underneath that VAT registration. There are about 300,000 households, smallholder farmers. Another 2.2 or 2.3 million households reporting that there's farming activity. So there's a vast difference on your large-scale farmers, 2,600. Look at the employment at the bottom. Those 2,600 farmers are employing about 50% of the total labor force of the country. So again, making a big contribution into exports, into competitive value chains, and into jobs. The bigger numbers around household food security is towards the right. So we need to understand these dynamics, and in terms of the solutions that we're finding and bringing the inclusiveness into the sectors, these are the optics that we need to look at. And again, the importance is there's room, there's a requirement for these diverse value chains. And just a reminder on natural resource potential. If you look at the pie charts, that's what South Africa, that's what the Lord has given to us. These are the natural resources, our land, our climate, our water resources. And if we just understand that, 55% extensive pasture, 28% intensive. We have 14% of field crops, extensive field crops, around about 13 million to 16 million hectares. That is arable. Currently in production, around about 13 million. Intensive field crops, about 1%, and orchards, about 2%. That's from a natural resource potential. And if we look at the opportunity again, this is a table that was recently done by the ARC. It's a very good study that maps, and what they did is the plus farms, 1.8 million hectares out of the 4.8 was assessed, and where they looked what is happening on these farms and what could be produced on these farms. And this was a stock take done. So it's amazing numbers that are actually coming out. If you just look at the 1.8 million that was surveyed, we actually have 230,000 hectares of field crops. Horticulture, about 84,000. Livestock, 1.5 million hectares. Look at the irrigation. I took out that number. It's an amazing number. 50,000 hectares of irrigation on those plus farms. And if you look at the report, and the majority of those farms are either underutilized, unproductive, or not much happening. So we have a very specific opportunity in this space. And if you look at the maps that have been produced by colleagues at the Department of Agriculture, you can clearly see that those have now been identified. And that's part of also the master plan is, let's find those areas and be more specific and understand how can we unlock this underutilized land that we've been talking about for quite some time now. The implication for the nature of our farming system, it's huge for capital investments. And what we present in this graph is just CapEx, OpEx. And if you look at the left-hand side, that's your CapEx, OpEx rands per hectare. So look at the numbers there. On the extreme right, orchards, around about 800, and this is an average. I know there are more intensive operations going way over 1 million, but we're looking at about a CapEx, OpEx of 800,000 rand per hectare investment. Those returns, the gross margins, yes, they can exceed 160, 200,000 rand per hectare, but your capital requirement is high. The skills base, the speciality in those markets is very high, and the risks are very high. Then you find your vegetables, you get down to your grains and your oilseeds, in other words, lower investments per hectare on average, and then you get to your extensive livestock. So margins are much smaller. So these realities have to influence farm size, for example. The return to family living. Those are important indicators, again, if we are establishing, bringing new farmers, bringing more black farmers into the production system. These are realities all need to be taken into consideration to ensure that we create sustainability at Farmgate. And why is it so important? Because the international competitors are breathing down our neck. They are right there. And this graph, if you can just look at the comparison on lines, the red line gives our average cost per ton of maize produced if we take the last 2015 till 2020 into consideration. If we would drop that drought year, look at that line dropping to the yellow line, which is 1,100. Where are our international competitors? They're lying at 900. So we are about 200 rand just above on average for the last 4 or 5 seasons with better yields. So this just gives you a feel for how close this and how competitive this world is that we need to produce in. That's the maize that needs to go into our intensive livestock systems that provides a staple food for our nation. And that brings us to productivity. A number of debates are currently happening, and we have those also in Africa, many of those countries that we're engaging in. And sometimes it's a bit of a wake-up call, if I have to be honest, in South Africa. There are some debates currently being made, or arguments around going back to open pollinators. Now that is really not a good idea, because if we just understand productivity rates and the availability of our seed system, we have highly effective seed supply chains. Good quality seed. And we need to drive that. Why? Because the productivity will ensure that we can compete internationally, that we keep our system competitive. So we need to support and bring in the best varieties of seed that we possibly can. So if you just compare those numbers, and I'm just going to do 2 for maize and soybeans. If you look at those bars, yes, our absolute yield levels are lower than the US, for example. But look at those green diamonds. Those present the average growth rate per annum over the last 10 years. And there you can see per annum, we've been growing at about 3% on average, our yields, which is very much in line with US, Argentina, and even higher than Brazil. So in competitive-wise, productivity-wise, we are right there with the big exporters, and that's what you need to benchmark yourself with, the big exporting countries. Soybeans, the same story. Look at those 3 triangles there, the green ones, US, Brazil, South Africa. We are right there close to 3% per annum. Those are the kind of productivity gains and rates that we require to have a more cost-effective system feeding our supply chain. The areas where we're lagging behind, sunflower. Look at the major exporters, Ukraine, Russia. Their yield gains are faster than ours. And the same for wheat. There we have Russia, fast growth, Argentina, fast growth. Those are the big exporters currently in the world market. So productivity links to climate, links to research. And I've just shown these images. On the left-hand side, these are currently, it's a consortium that BFAP is part of, Grain SA, universities, University Illinois, which we are enrolling out to commercial farmers. And these are variable seeding rates. It just gives us an example of technology in farming. And if you invite our American counterparts, They're finding that their comments is always they're amazed to see how competitive and how much technology there is actually in South Africa. Why? The reality is on the right-hand side. A 100-year graph of rainfall in South Africa. Look at the trend over the last few years. And if you look at that outline there, the 2015-16 drought, colleagues, I know that graph's a bit small, but that last bar there, you can see it, it's been the driest year in 112 years. So our climate is under pressure, but despite of these rains, and if you can look at those trends, even in the recent years with these very good yields and good crops, our rainfall is significantly lower than what we had in the 70s, where we actually had very higher rainfall than what we're currently having. So just interesting trends in terms of climate. And I want to get to the end of this part just providing context. Now this is a fascinating graph. This is maize production in Eastern and Southern Africa. And our projection is that this year, it's the largest maize crop in the history of this total region. So we are projecting a maize crop of around about 45 million tons for this season. And you can see where this maize crop is coming from, at about 20 million tons. So colleagues, a lot has happened in our neighboring countries. For those who are trading, you felt the change. They're actually surplus producers. Zambia is a surplus producer, Uganda is a surplus producer, Malawi is a surplus producer. So there's surplus production of maize coming into the market. And if you look at the yields, we know that productivity is very low in a number of these countries, 1.68 tons per hectare in 2000. Currently, average, we're estimating at 2.57 tons per hectare, still very low. They can do much better if we could get those value chains going. And that brings me back to that graph that I illustrated earlier from IFPRI. Remember how big that primary agriculture is, the contribution to the economy, but how small the agro-processing and the value chains are. So without those value chains feeding into your agriculture system, and that's a lot of times our argument. We hear a lot in academic circles, mainly, that there must be a big drive in productivity. Our argument is, and if you talk to private sector, says that productivity can't go without investment in the value chain. You need to pull that grain. And the practical illustration that we're having currently is, guess where's the cheapest maize in the world? It's Malawi, $145 a ton. Our projections can go even lower, $120 a ton. That is way below the world price. But 2 seasons ago, their price was $300 a ton. So what's happening in Malawi? Major surpluses, lack of processing capacity, lack of transport, too expensive, landlocked, and where do you go with your surpluses? So you need to create that value chain to work away, to pull away your surpluses, getting down and really working within the agro-processing value chain to get those prices up again, because farmers are not going to survive at $145 a ton. Lastly, this has major implications for their trade patterns. On the left-hand side is South Africa. Look, the line above 0 gives you our total export bill. These are net exports. Those are all positive. Below the line, yes, we're importing. We're importing palm, we are importing rice, and we'll talk about that in a moment. That's okay. We are major exporters. Look on the right-hand side. That's Sub-Saharan Africa's import bill. Essentially only exporting some of the unprocessed products. For example, some fruits, there's some coffee, but they're major importers a lot on the processed products. So what's happening here? And they're net importers. Again, the point made around value chains, the importance of agro-processing that needs to be invested in these chains. I want to move on to the opportunities. Local markets, import replacement, export growth, and agro-processing. And I'll go through these a bit quicker. Can the agriculture and agro-processing master plan support NDP goals? And what we did in this graph, just summarizing what was the view of the NDP, and we split out the categories. You'll remember what were the 3 big pillars. It was the underutilized land, export growth, and the agro-processing and the links. Those were the 3 main pillars for the NDP. So what we split out here, and we assessed what was the performance of these 3, and we split it out into formal and informal. So the top right-hand corner in your graph, you have high-value, labor-intensive exports. we had major expansions in the area of around about 70,000 hectares in expansion of high-value crops. How did we manage that? Through substitution. So some of the commodities or crops, for example, wine was replaced by citrus, and we have others. Macadamias replaced maize in the Northern Cape. We have major efficiency gains in water at the farm gate. So we've seen significant performance improvement. Our estimate, and this is almost from the part of the surveys that we've done, we think that secondary jobs in the informal value chains have performed very well, but we don't have evidence on that. The job creation is slightly lower, but we do see a lot more activity in the surveys that we've done, but it's still a question mark where more research needs to be done. The secondary value chains, the jobs in the formal value chains, and those were the big firms that I just mentioned, those bubbles. They did well. The growth, not as fast as primary sector, slightly slower, but still making a solid contribution and growing. Then we have your non-labor intensive commercial agriculture that grew fast, but the contribution to labor, which is your y-axis, is lower. We know that it's not labor intensive. And then on the right-hand side, your emerging producers. Now what we can debate this, we've given this category the highest score. Because if you look at the last 10 years since the NDP, this is a category, and the producer organizations, a lot of you are sitting in this room, who've created a big contribution, or made a big contribution to this category of farmers. 10 years ago, where we had only a few in this category, now we have a few thousand, being supported by producer organizations, having mentorship, having finance, access to finance. So this category is growing fast, but the scale is still low. So we need to think about that, saying, well, what is the opportunity to boost the scale? And then on the left-hand side, your smallholder subsistent producers and your land reform and underutilized land. That's literally the category that we've put in the bottom left, growing not nearly where it could grow. So this is really the tension that needs to turn to this category and say, how can we make this better? And you don't make that better by neglecting the fast-growing ones. You make that better by actually creating that pull from the other value chains. I'm not going to go through this detail, colleagues. Those that are involved in the master plan, this is what we're currently busy with colleagues at the NIMC, in the department, private sector, working together, finding for each of the pillars very specific interventions that need to be unlocked. And if you just eyeball your bottom line, and again, this is an opportunity. This is out there. We can create a lot more turnover in the agriculture sector. We can grow more crops. We can employ more people. But if we don't get the environment right, if we don't get these interventions implemented, it's literally a pie in the sky. And I'm not going to take you through this detail, but what is the secret around this? It is an integrated value chain approach. So we're excited also, Jeffrey mentioned that, and I think that is absolutely the right move, to work together in an integrated value chain where you have your markets, you start at your markets, you understand how large these markets are. Now this flow diagram is just an example of the poultry master plan. So Isak, you know this graph very well, but it specifically focuses on interventions, and the red ones are the ones that government needs to act on. The blue ones, that's where private sector is acting on. And the blue-red combination is where public-private partnerships typically meet. So what we're doing in this work is actually identifying at each node in the value chain the opportunity or the intervention that's required and what additional value could be created at that specific node. I want to move on to food security. We talk a lot about food security. What's the opportunity? Just eyeball this graph. On the left-hand side, you've got commercial cattle. And where's the poverty density? I'm coming back to the arguments around commercial chains delivering into urban centers where we have the highest number of low-income households. The biggest poverty is in urban centers. But the biggest concentration of low-income household is in rural areas. But look at the concentration of cattle. That's where we have the largest concentration of cattle. So what needs to happen there is productivity gains. We've had notoriously low productivity rates in those areas, 30% calving rate, lack of biosecurity, lack of veterinary support services. So how can we uplift the productivity in those areas? And if we can really get it right, the numbers are there. We can do it. It just needs action and implementation. A lot of arguments around exports and import replacement and agro-processing. This graph just presents to you on top of the line, the zero line, that gives you whatever South Africa is exporting. Below the line is what South Africa is importing. And what's interesting on that x-axis is it gives you the percentage share of consumer expenditure. So if we just want to get a feel for what are consumers spending their money on, the biggest item is wheat products. Secondly, chickens. Then beef, then maize, and then we get to milk, rice, edible oils, etc. So what are the commodities, the food items that we're big importers on? I mentioned those. Chicken, wheat, rice, edible, and pork. Some of these industries, and not going into the detail, Tracy will talk a little bit more about that, we're just not going to produce more on it. Palm oil, that's the edible oil side. We have a chance, we are growing the oil that comes from soybean. Soybean production is growing. But we have about 500,000 tons of palm oil coming in very competitively into the country. We're not going to replace all of that. It's just not possible. We can do some of it, but we need to be realistic if we talk about import replacement. Furthermore, it's not only about the cost of production, it's a supply chain again. Now, what this graph is showing us is just soybean, the success story in terms of increasing numbers of soybeans crushed and crushing capacity around 2 million tons comfortably if we take this 80% utilization into consideration. But we're getting to a second phase in this growth spurt of soybeans, which is becoming a longer-term equilibrium that we're typically seeing in maize. So our projection is that within the next season or two, and this season actually we're shot right up there into that space, is we're getting to a saturation level in terms of the inland markets where we have sufficient local, we're getting closer to self-sufficiency in terms of soybeans. So what's happening to soybean prices? Trending rather closer to your derived price, between the derived price and export parity, where in the historic period, and Tracy will show some of those graphs, we're actually trending closer to import parity. So we're getting on the inland closer to self-sufficiency, but what's happening in the coast? 30% of our feed consumption, and it costs about 700 Rand a ton to take the feed down to the coast. So the costs are just too expensive in a number of instances. So occasionally the margins are large enough in terms of crushing, and if you take the total oil seed complex into consideration, it makes sense. But overall, we need to look at transportation costs to bring the product down to the coast. There's growth in alternatives like canola in the coastal areas, but not sufficient to meet all of the demand that we have in the coastal areas. And we have more production opportunities. There again, right-hand side, Eastern Cape. They're big areas, but there's big lack of infrastructure and activities in those areas. I want to conclude with implementation. I've talked about the graph on the right-hand side, where those farms are. We know what the gap is between commercial farmers, the commercial yields, and the informal yields. They just simply need to move up. And there are examples, and we've talked about them briefly. Just want to show that graph. This is the yields achieved for 6,000 smallhold farmers, 1 hectare farms that were in a Grain SA Farmer Development Program. So we have these stats. BFAP's been doing the monitoring and evaluation on these smallholder farmers. Look at the yields. We've compared those to the yields that are actually sitting in that area, the typical non-commercial yields of 1.8 tons per hectare. These farmers were at 4 tons per hectare. So the monitoring platform has provided that. Now I just want to backtrack to this graph here. Look at Eastern Cape. The light blue gives government spending share. The dark blue gives gross value added share. So it's not about spending, there's a lot of money spent in this province, but the gross value added to agriculture out of the Eastern Cape is very low. So the question is not always around spending the money, it's a question around how efficient this money is being spent. and where you can get private sector into that province to get more of these projects rolling. And this brings me to the last concept. This is what BFAP is engaging in now, what we refer to as the roadmap to inclusive agriculture transformation. This is a new initiative that we're working and expanding in terms of partnerships. What is a roadmap all about? A roadmap provides you with a guide on where you want to go. It measures progress. You want to see how far you are down the road. And it informs you around your strategic thinking. Which direction are we going? If we're not achieving our goals, how do we adapt? How do we change? So BFAP's roadmap to inclusive agriculture transformation sets out to measure progress on the desired development goals in agriculture transformation to the benefit of all stakeholders. So how do we do this? There's so much data around, and that's the circle. And you can see it's good surveys done. A lot of the data sits with producer organizations. Stats SA does some. NAMC does some of the surveys. There are the provincial departments, a lot of times have very good data. That data is also, in a lot of cases, not centralized or coordinated. So what our vision is to coordinate, to structure this data into a system that we can get a broader context and understanding around total inclusive agriculture transformation in the country. So again, there are all the partners, a combination of databases and partnerships that we'll be engaging with, or that we've already started the road on, in terms at least from a monitoring evaluation side, where we've developed a system. So in a number of these producer organizations, we're currently busy with the M&E work around the design and integration of data, the tools that are developed, that we've developed around measurement and data capturing, whether it's the geospatial references, in-field data capturing, bulk upload of data, putting that through the system, and then at the end of the day, developing an interactive dashboard to really understand what is our benchmark, and at the end of the day, also measuring the transformation footprint and bringing that into a user-friendly, centralized database where one can actually measure progress. And just some practical examples. This is work that we've been also doing for the sugar industry, just assessing risk and the impact of climate and being very specific. If you just look at those regions that we've highlighted in the coastal areas, so we can spatially model and understand where are the potential areas of risk. And if you put it through the system, what's the future for these farmers? I'm concluding, just summarizing. What is key? It's the efficient coordination of institutions and departments. And what are the 4 pillars, which we keep on referring as the preconditions for inclusive growth? It's a stable policy environment. It's the producer support and innovation. It's infrastructure, and it's efficient state services. Colleagues, I'm going to end here, and I'm going to hand over straight to Tracy for the presentation of the commodities. Thank you very much.